Hey everyone, would like to let you know before today's video begins that there will be major spoilers for Deltarune, especially with Chapter 5, so before you watch this video, please just go play Chapter 5 to make sure that I don't spoil anything for you. Now, back to the video. There's a problem with identifying the Roaring Knight as any character in Deltarune, and that has only been made worse by the fact that Chapter 5 has weakened the evidence load for a lot of different potential candidates for the Knight's identity. But before we actually get into discussing who the Knight might be now, we should go over the Knight's known abilities. The Knight is able to create dark fountains, which usually is required to have large amounts of determination to be able to do, which is only found in Lighteners, which are humans and monsters. And a Darkner doesn't have the amount of determination necessary to open up a dark fountain. This is important for later. The Knight is known to be able to shapeshift because of the fact that, it can revert to its one disc form whenever it needs to, go somewhere quickly, or can also get into that, weird, eagle form. I'm just gonna call it an eagle, whenever it, kidnaps someone, with Asgore at the end of Chapter 5, or Undyne at the end of Chapter 3. The Knight is also shown to be able to use telekinesis, especially in Chapter 3 when it tries to abduct Toriel initially. And most importantly of all, the Knight has determination, which already rules out several possibilities for who it might be. Because it can't be a Darkner then. So, for the first candidate, I'm going to be going off with the most commonly agreed with identity of the Knight. That would be December Holiday. Des is missing, as we can see by basically every piece of dialogue about her in every single chapter of Deltarune up to date. December was also Chris's role model, so I think naturally they would try to work with Des if they knew that the Knight were Des, which would explain why Chris was always holding back in the Chapter 3 Knight fight. And December, through knowing Asgore, pretty close because family friend and whatnot, and also having Carol as her mother. Carol was the mayor, so she'd have that bunker code. And combined with the fact that the Knight also apparently has access to the church, as seen at the end of Chapter 4, we can say that it's safe to assume that December would have gotten the shelter code from there too. So, Des would have complete access to all 3 shelter codes. That completely checks out. However, there are also downsides to this. Asgore states that he first would have seen the Roaring Knight on the day that Des went missing, which doesn't really make sense unless Des had already disappeared and had been made into the Roaring Knight in, less than 12 hours, which is, kind of pretty quick. Des also lacks a clear intention to be the Knight. What would she want to be doing as the Knight? I don't think that she'd really want to do the roaring. She wouldn't have any motivation to do it. I don't really, sure, she could be trying to get her body back, or restart the timeline so she doesn't die, but that just sounds weird. And then there's also the voice in the code, which seems to be Des. Unless the voice in the code is, Des' soul, and the Knight is Des' dust, or, I don't know, comatose body somewhere, I don't know. So, I'd say that, Des has, the most evidence pre-Chapter 5, and, tied for most evidence post-Chapter 5. And then let's move on to everyone's second favorite candidate before Chapter 5, Carol Holiday. Carol would have access to all of the shelter codes, because she is the mayor, she already has that shelter code, and then she has access to the police chief shelter code, and then she would also have access to the church shelter code. She basically just administers the shelter codes, so she'd know them all. She knows the player based off of the fact that in the one scene of Chapter 4, she says, "You are welcome here anytime," you with the red text indicating that she's referring to the player, not Chris. and she also seems to be the center of the conspiracy in Hometown. On the other hand, what's stopping her from being the Roaring Knight would be, well, Rudy. Rudy is in the hospital. He's ill and injured and possibly dying at the end of Chapter 5, so I doubt she would just, run away out of the hospital because, well, I guess I gotta go to the Flower King now. Watch your father, Noelle. Be safe. Bye. And she also doesn't seem to be the hands-on type that the knight is. She seems to be more of the commander of sorts. She's the boss. She isn't going to be getting her hands dirty with that sort of thing. That doesn't really match her personality. And also, there's the whole Chapter 4 timing error. So unless she was going around and being in two places at once, because we know that phones don't really work right in the Dark World, so I don't really understand then how Carol, the voice on the phone, would really be able to be the Roaring Knight at the same time, because, well, just phones don't work right in the Dark World. And I feel like that itself is very, explanatory. So let's move on to our next candidate, which was basically completely disproven by Chapter 5. Rudy Holiday. So Rudy would have, once again, full bunker access because, well, we know he's in good with Father Alvin. His wife is literally Carol, so he has that bunker code too. And then, Asgore, so that's also that, bunker code. He has clear motivations because he'd want to find his daughter, December. And the attitude matches because what we can surmise from, I guess his dialogue in the hospital, but also I'd have to say Flowery, because Flowery seems to be Asgore's sort of Dark World manifestation of what Rudy was like for him. Rudy seems to, before the terminal illness and before, the kids and, settling down and whatnot, he seems to have had a lot more of an energetic personality, kind of like Flowery and whatnot. So I'd have to say that based off of Flowery's personality and, that level of, showmanship, it also sort of matches with, the fact that the knight kind of shows off quite a bit and showboats during their fights and in Chapter 4. Now, what sort of goes against this is the fact that Rudy is, terminally ill. He isn't very, physically there anymore when it comes to strength. And then he's also in the hospital at the end of Chapter 5, probably surrounded by loved ones, so I doubt he could just, escape out of nowhere. And then, why would he kidnap Asgore? Because Asgore's his best friend, right? So, it doesn't add up. So why also can't it be any of the Fun Gang? Because they've already fought the Roaring Knight. We've seen Chris on screen at the same time as the Roaring Knight, so unless, Chris's soul is secretly piloting the Roaring Knight, I heavily doubt it's Chris. Actually, maybe. And let's move on to our next real candidate, Asriel Dreemurr. So the attitude match, based off the fact that if you look at how he acts in his fight at the end of Undertale versus how the Roaring Knight acts during their fight and in Chapter 4, and also sort of in Chapter 5, but the Knight isn't really seen as much. Asriel is Chris's older brother, so naturally they would, follow whatever plan that Asriel was a part of too. Asriel is a known powerhouse in the Undertale Deltarune universe and is likely just about as strong, if not stronger, than the Knights. Asriel would have clear intentions because, finding Des, who is likely his romantic interest based off of the letter we can read in Chapter 5's beginning. It begins with Dearest December and whatnot, so you can sort of figure out that, and then also the dialogue of other hometown residents. And also, Asriel would already have extremely high plot relevance, so yeah, I guess, two characters, the same plot relevance, same amount of plot relevance, that is. You'd sort of think that, yeah, they could definitely be, same person, two different roles. However, on the other side, it's the fact they'd be a bit repetitive because Asriel is already the final boss of Undertale's pacifist route. I also doubt that Asgore would attack Asriel in the Dark World and want to, parade Asriel's body around town. And Asriel is in college. That's about it. So I think that he's sort of tied with Des, though, now for, having equal as much evidence. And then let's get to the little bonus one. The Great Papyrus. The only thing that's really working in his favor is the fact that, the Knight is a very cool and, intimidating knight, what Papyrus wanted to be. He wanted to be cool and a member of the Royal Guard. Papyrus so far has been unseen, and Also, Papyrus is, he's a skeleton, so he can fit into that, very skeletal knight armor that really any character could really fit in, because, well, if you've seen the knight, you know how, like, it looks like a Victorian era noble. Just like a little bit of corset usage, And on the con list for why Papyrus would be the knight is that Papyrus is Papyrus. He's an absolute goofball. I doubt he'd actually be, the Roaring Knight, because he's too goofy, he's too clumsy. I really doubt that the Roaring Knight would match up with him. And if the knight is not a lightener, the knight might be like Dess's Dust. Because, like I said earlier, Dess's Soul could be the voice in the code, while Dess's Dust is sort of, it became the Knight because just the Dark World version of it. The Knight also might be like a Titan, because both are made up of, like, a solid dark substance, and both sort of have that, like, static effect whenever they're injured. And then it also could be like Ralse or Ram type of, like, imaginary friend manifested in the Dark World, because the Roaring Knight can still, like, hop between Dark Worlds, and that isn't really a problem. So, on to the last thing. We have a conclusion to talk about here. Now, who is the Roaring Knight? I'd have to go with likely either Asriel or December. Mainly just because of the fact that all other candidates at this point are pretty much exhausted for who it could be. Because, like, even if you thought it could be someone like Undyne or Asgore or Toriel or, just like any other person who's pretty strong in, like, Undertale, they've already been seen and the timing just doesn't match up with them, or they've already been on screen with the Knights. So, I do think there are really only two possibilities anymore for who the Knight can be, and that is Asriel and Dess. So, we are basically just back to square one for this all over again. So, to everyone who had already thought that December was the Knight, good for you. To everybody who thinks that Asriel might be the Knight, good for you. You both have about, like, equal amount of evidence in my eyes after Chapter 5. If you liked the video, like and subscribe, and if you want to use any part of this, just credit me, please. Have a great day, y'all.